Welcome to this panel discussion on science, creativity and learning as part of the Norwich Science Festival. My name's John Gordon and I host this panel as academic lead for the University of East Anglia's new CreativeUEA initiative, but I also work in UEA's School of Education and Lifelong Learning. And our panel is comprised of colleagues all of whom work in education, who represent different phases in education. And through the panel discussion, we're going to explore the relationships between science, creativity and learning. We have 5 guests in the panel for discussion today. And if I come to each of our guests in turn, we'll just hear a little bit about their current role and their background in science education. So if I come first of all to our colleague Rebecca, please.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Lamb and I work at Stalham Infant and Junior Schools in North Norfolk. It is a primary school for children aged 2 to 11. I am teaching and learning lead and also science and writing lead there. I'm very passionate about developing creativity in primary science and also developing science capital and promoting science in the community in which I work.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and very glad you can join us today. And if I come now to our colleague Philip.
Well, hi, I'm Philip Hookway. I'm an assistant principal at Thoughts Andrew School in sixth form, which is just on the outskirts of Norwich. I've been teaching science for about 15 years. That includes things like A-level biology, but also A-level science and society, A-level applied science. And I'm actually really worried about the creativity or lack of creativity that some of our young people are thinking is involved in science, and science and creativity are 2 separate items, but in actual fact they are not.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip, and that's a really helpful point for maybe for our agenda or areas for discussion through our conversation. Thank you. And if we come now to our guest Keith Tabor.
Good evening. Yes, I'm Keith Tabor. I'm Professor Emeritus at Cambridge in the Faculty of Education, Professor of Science Education. But I started my career as a science teacher in comprehensive schools. I spent some time in further education, where I was mostly dealing with A-level physics and chemistry, as well as a little bit of adult work. When I came to Cambridge, I initially worked mostly in teacher training on the secondary PGCE and the middle school PGCE. And then last 10 years of my career, I was mostly teaching research methods, which was to education students, but I always thought of research methods as being a very sciencey sort of thing.
Thank you very much, Keith. That's a very helpful introduction. And also now if we come to Miriam, who also has expertise in science teacher education, among other areas. Miriam, please.
Hello, my name is Miriam Jones. I'm a lecturer in education at UEA and I predominantly work on the primary PGCE. So I teach primary science to trainee teachers and also professional studies, and I have a particular interest in special needs as well. I was a SENCO for many years. I came into science education in interesting routes. My first degree is actually in history, but during my PGCE I was very interested in science teaching and went on to obtain further qualifications in leading science education in primary schools. So I taught for 18 years in primary education, Key Stage 1 and 2, and the last 8 years I was a head teacher too, and I've worked here as a lecturer for 6 years.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And finally, if we come to our 5th guest, Dave Jones.
Yeah, hello, I'm Dave Jones. I am actually Miriam's counterpart at UEA, so I am the other science tutor on the primary PGCE. My background is actually analytical chemistry, so before becoming a teacher, about 16 years ago, I worked in various roles in various industrial labs, doing everything from offshore testing to cosmetics, you name it. I did various different things. So coming into teach science is something that actually is a subject I'm really passionate about. It is what I've done throughout pretty much my entire time at school and everything beyond then as well. So it's really the centre point of what I've been doing in my career.
Thank you very much, Dave, and also for making that link as well with education and then the wide world of work, which I'm sure we'll touch on in the panel discussion as well. In terms of our format for the conversation, we're going to hear shortly from members of the panel, each of whom have prepared a statement about an area of science, learning and creativity, a facet of those elements and their relationships that they'd like to speak to everyone about, and then the panel will follow on with response and further comment to those statements. And so through those discussions we'll explore the relationships between science, learning and creativity. But we anticipate that beyond those as well, the conversation will develop to consider what makes good science teaching as it relates to creativity as well, and perhaps even more specific and sometimes related to very precise details of practice. How do we support the development of not only students who think creatively in relation to science, but also teachers who are creative in their practices as well. And around that, we'll be looking particularly closely at what is perhaps inherently creative about science. And so just before we begin to hear statements from colleagues, if I just share two fairly simple definitions that I think are key to our discussion today as starting points. And the first is really just to offer a definition of science, which may be considered as the intellectual and practical activities encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behaviour of the physical and natural world, often through observation and experiment. And then for creativity, here is a definition drawn from the recent Durham Commission on Creativity. And the definition of creativity here is simply the capacity to express, imagine, conceive, or make something that wasn't there before. So a couple of starting points for us there, and I'm sure we'll hear from colleagues with examples, instances which elaborate on those definitions and maybe even contest those definitions points as well. Okay, so to move to our conversation now, we're going to hear first of all from Philip and then Dave with some comments on creativity as it relates to education. Philip, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, please.
Hi. So as I said earlier, I am really concerned about this sort of separation between creativity and knowledge within science, and the fact that many young people approach science thinking it is not a creative subject. I am a art student, or I am a science student. Now, I do believe that to be creative in science, we do need a baseline of knowledge to enable that creativity to exist. So, for example, we couldn't write a creative story about Colin, the carbon atom, going through a carbon cycle if we didn't know the very basis of the carbon cycle that it alludes to. Or on for example, at A level, we couldn't design and implement a really quite creative experiment that one of my students did, which was to actually try to apply the costings of disinfecting the entire Norfolk and Norwich hospital through an applied science A-level practical. Now, without the basic knowledge, that sort of creativity can't be shown through science. So my point to start with is that whilst we must be creative, there must also be enabling scientists, teachers and students to have that knowledge to actually enable that creativity. Without that basis, I think that's where we begin to fall down.
Thank you very much, Philip, for starting us off there, actually with a focus on knowledge, which I know is an area, Dave, that you would like to comment on as well as it relates to creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Phil, in terms of you can't be creative about something you know nothing about. You need to be able to understand how something works or what's involved in it in order to then start to consider how to manipulate or come at it from a different perspective or do something different, or to consider that whether or not the way it's being done is the right way to do it or the most effective way to do it. And I just actually linking on to what you're saying about the Durham definition of creativity, I do slightly disagree with the last part of it about to create something that wasn't there before, because actually for me, doing something that is different to what was there before, but still doing the same thing to achieve something, but doing it in a different way is also massively creative. So there's not necessarily that something completely novel and different has to be created, but actually going about something in a different way can be just as creative. But I think, linking into what Phil was saying about the knowledge that's required by the children, but actually from a primary perspective, when you're thinking about the teaching that occurs within primary school, you're thinking about the teachers. A lot of the teachers come from very, very diverse backgrounds with lots of different experiences in lots of different subjects. And there are actually very few very specific science specialists, which means that in order to be creative with your teaching in science, you've got to be confident in your subject knowledge in science, but you've also got to be confident about your teaching of science. So you've got a lot to consider. That you may be an English specialist, so you feel really confident to take risks and do something different and approach English teaching in a really creative, engaging manner. But actually, and something we'll probably talk about later is that if you are not a confident scientist or a confident mathematician or something like that, then you are going to be less likely to take those risks, because you're going to be very conscious about what happens if it goes wrong. And I think that's just that bit of being a teacher, it's often not thought about, particularly in primary, and the knowledge and understanding and confidence of the teacher that's involved.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to come straight to Keith now, who I can see would like to respond to the comments we've heard.
Yeah, not so much as a response as a kind of adjunct to this idea of creating something new. And I think sometimes in literature you talk about small c and large c creativity, and it's the idea that somebody creates something that's new for them. So it may not be new to the teacher, it may not be new to the outside world, but it's still creative, it's new to them. Just as one example, I remember interviewing an A-level student once, and basically the student invented the idea of Van der Waals forces. She talked herself into the idea of Van der Waals forces, which she hadn't yet learnt about in class. Now, I was very impressed with that. And the fact that actually Van der Waals got there before her, I didn't in any way undermine the fact that she was taking ideas, playing with ideas and saying, well, actually, if we think that, then surely this should be the case. And I think that was an example of creativity. She created something that was new for her. And that was what mattered, not whether it was new for the universe as a whole.
Rebecca.
Yes, just driving on what Dave and Phil was talking about, from my point of view as primary subject lead, I'm very lucky in the sense that I have a science degree, so I'm very confident in my subject knowledge. And one of the greatest challenges that I have in the supportive way that I look after the staff in the school and in the area is their subject knowledge. And I think one of the vital things that has sort of been fundamental to our success, really, and something that I think we need to do a lot more of, is having a lot more interaction with the secondary schools in our area. They have the subject knowledge, and it's almost a beautiful marriage in that sense. They have the subject knowledge because they have degrees in that subject, whereas in primary we are very used to mixing subjects. We teach a lot of different subjects, so that creativity element, which is really paramount in primary science. There are so many things that we can learn from one another, and I think one of the things I really want to drive home is the importance of making that connection and being in it together. Us as Norfolk, or us in whatever area that we're in, is supporting one another in order to develop this, because we're all in it to support the creativity for the children. And I think we have examples when we as teachers are training in our PGCEs, whatever way that we do it. We have fantastic people such as Dave and Miriam supporting us with primary science, but that's where it ends. And I think that's where it's really important that we, you know, support one another in those elements and seek to look around all of the areas that can help us.
I'm not a science specialist myself, so I wonder from hearing your comments, Rebecca, and responding to what other colleagues have said, is it the case then that different phases address or embed creativity? Well, first of all, maybe they embed them differently, but would colleagues feel that some phases embed creativity more effectively than others in formal education?
I would say my experiences, so I didn't address this before, so apologies. So my prior experience is that I was formerly a secondary science teacher, and my specialism was the transition between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. And one of the things that I found when going into Key Stage 3 classrooms is we had most of a cross-curricular creative element of learning. And then when we moved into secondary, in the experience that I had in the school that I was in, is that it was very much focusing on a singular disciplinary element rather than drawing on other subjects that you can use to apply that creativity. I remember applying some primary strategies that I'd learned in my training, and the staff were really surprised that I would maybe drawing examples from English, and that we would be maybe using our knowledge of computing to do start-stop animation to show our understanding, and that is something that I think that our secondary colleagues can really learn from our primary colleagues, in the same way that we can learn from science subject knowledge from our secondary colleagues.
Thank you, Rebecca. And if I come to Dave and then Miriam straight after Dave. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, it's very closely linked to that. I was actually going to say it's whether or not that very clear definition between, you know, you're doing science, you're doing maths, you're doing English, you're doing, particularly when you get into secondary, actually prevents that understanding of actually where science fits within other subjects and where other subjects fit and contribute into science. So you almost stop the opportunity to be able to see where you can take things creatively by almost pigeonholing it into those individual subjects.
Thanks, Dave. And Miriam?
Thank you. Yes, I completely agree with everything Rebecca's said. And one of the things I was thinking about in preparation for this discussion was that the nature of the fact that on the PGCE we try very hard to make sure that we address, you know, how we teach children, how we work scientifically, how we impart that knowledge, but also through working scientifically, but then also how we make those links to other subjects. And I do think primary phases do that really well. But then completely in agreement with what Rebecca was saying, one of the most successful projects I did in a primary school with Year 6 was where we worked with secondary colleagues to prepare, it was sort of an information stand where the children showed what they'd learned about plants, with people that were just walking through the market hall in the local town that I worked in, and it was an amazing project, had a really good endpoint, and that work really supported the children in their understanding, and we had that cross-curricular element to it. So I think it's really important that we do focus on what makes science teaching really good with our trainees, but we also keep that creativity, not just of science, but actually of linking with other subjects too.
Thanks, Miriam, and Philip as well.
And I think it's really important, especially for our most disadvantaged students, that the cross links between subjects are made, because that is when you start inherently building your cultural capital and your creative cultural capital as well, which is, of course, something that our most disadvantaged students struggle to get a foot through the door, and where they can feel almost left out in other realms, for example, future job interviews looking forward. And I think there is a great opportunity for science to drive that creativity and also build upon the cultural capital that can actually give students doing this. And I think that's something we shouldn't ignore.
Thanks, Philip. And I'll come back to you, Miriam.
Yeah, and to build upon that, it's often those disadvantaged students that don't have as many opportunity to be able to have that rich experience, and we need to bring that into classrooms. I think it's really important.
Thanks very much, Miriam. I'm intrigued. So, Philip, you've introduced the idea of cultural capital there as well. Do you mind just commenting a little bit on how that term's used in education? What we mean by that?
Simply put, it is the broader knowledge that a student has to be able to utilise that throughout the wider range. So, for example, to have a mix of history, art, for example, knowing the roots of words to actually then make those cross-curricular links, not only within, for example, science, but between subjects, a bit like Dave said earlier, breaking down barriers between subjects to actually, because we are teachers, we're here to teach the whole child. We are, a creative science UEA talk at the moment, but we are teachers that create the whole child. And if we don't actually focus on building a cultural capital, which many of us may have been lucky enough to almost absorb through our early childhood and our good schooling, our most disadvantaged students do not actually have that opportunity. We need to actively and proactively teach, for example, the history of science, or the links between science and MFL, science and art. For example, Da Vinci, fabulous artist, fabulous scientist. People think science and art are two ends of a string, but in actual fact, you bring the string together and you form a circle, and it's just one continuum. And I think that is really important, and our young people don't get it.
Thanks very much for that. And it sounds like there we're touching on the, if you like, the shape and content of the curriculum, or what we might desire in the curriculum, but also the needs of learners. And just recalling your point, Keith, as well, about a student who came to an understanding of a scientific concept, maybe without knowing the term of that concept, that they arrived at that themselves. And I wondered what panel members feel about the relationship of that sense of exploration and arriving at understanding, and where to find the balance between that and knowledge as well. I don't know whether, Keith, you would feel that student wouldn't have come to that realization themselves if they'd been overtly introduced to that concept. Do these things work concurrently, the exploratory dimension and knowledge? Can they work together?
Well, I maybe just briefly explain the context. It was actually a research interview where I was one of my own students, so I knew quite well, but I was actually interrogating this poor A-level student who was tolerating this remarkably well. But normally in education, of course, that's not what happens. Normally the teacher asks a question, most people keep their heads down, maybe somebody gives a one-word answer, somebody puts their hand up and says a few words, but they know it can be deflected away. Whereas when you've got somebody saying, well, why is that then? Well, why do you think that? So what would happen here? And you have this interrogation, then actually that really does provoke them to think. Now, I'm not, of course, recommending that we start interrogating children for education, but having that opportunity to play with ideas, develop ideas, explore ideas. I think this links to what I was going to say in my kind of little statement later, in that science has a very strong element of imagination and imaginative play, which we don't tend to see very much in science education. And I don't know if you want me to say that now or leave that till we come back to it, or.
It actually might be a good moment to elaborate on that, Keith, and then we'll come back to Dave. I can see Dave also wants to contribute, and I think Rebecca, you maybe did as well. But if you'd like to elaborate on that point now, Keith, it seems a good moment to do so.
Yeah, my point is that I would see imagination and creativity as being central to the scientific process, central to the practices of science. And colleagues have been talking about you need the knowledge before you can do anything practical, before anything creative with it. And that's one aspect of this. But actually, where does the knowledge come from? And scientific knowledge always comes from an active imagination. You know, I mean, there are famous examples like Einstein thinking to himself, what would it be like if I was moving at the speed of light and could see a ray of light from the side? It doesn't have to be as profound as that. But all scientific discoveries are initially an imaginative jump, and then it's tested. But when we talk about science in education, what the impression we tend to give is that science is about logic, science is about reasoning, and science is about rationality. And that, of course, is all very true. But that reasoning and logic and rationality always acts on someone's imaginative idea that they're exploring and testing. And without the imaginative idea, the rest of it doesn't work. So it's part of the same process. It's just as essential. And then you wonder, well, why is this not emphasized in science? And I think partly it's because of this fear of subjectivity, that we need to see science as an objective process. Even though we generally accept now that all scientific ideas are technically provisional, they're all open to being revisited with new evidence or new perspectives, we like to think that scientific ideas have been proven. Of course, proof is not something that occurs in science. Proof belongs to mathematics, but we like to see these things as being evidenced and out there and demonstrated. But to get to that stage, it has to go through this exploratory play, this play of ideas and then testing out ideas. Where science is different from, say, arts, is in arts. If somebody has a really exciting idea and does something with it, other people can make a subjective judgment about whether they like the idea or not. The same thing happens in science, but we only keep the idea once it's been tested against nature. So no matter how great your idea is, I mean, was it Huxley, I think, who said something like, the great tragedy of science is, a beautiful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. The whole history of science has been so many beautiful hypotheses destroyed by ugly facts. But that's how we make progress. But unless you have the beautiful hypotheses or even the ugly hypotheses, there's nothing to test. I think curriculum doesn't help. I think the fact that the curriculum has moved away from nature of science now more than it was a few years ago. So it's much more about the laws, the theories, the models, the things that have been demonstrated. And they come down by fear. So children don't get to see how these things came about, how it was an exploration, how the scientists got it all wrong 6 or 7 times before they got it right. All the weird ideas they tried out that didn't get anywhere. They don't see all that, which is part of the excitement of science. So I think the curriculum doesn't help. I think maybe teacher training, I was in teacher training for a number of years, for about 10 years or so, doesn't help because we don't emphasize that side. But I mean, I really think to give people an authentic feel of what science is about, you have to focus just as much on the imagination and creativity as on the logic, the reasoning and the rationality.
Thanks very much, Keith. Come to David now, and then to Miriam.
Yeah, to be honest, it kind of almost leads on from what Keith was going to say. I was going to say is that it's my view in terms of science. The creativity in science is question driven. It's about wonder and curiosity. It's about those things of what happens if I do this. I wonder what happens, why this is, and it's all those questions that you watch a small child trying to figure out the world around them, and everything they do is about them wondering why things do what they do. And you start to introduce more and more structure to things, and more actually you need to know certain things or you need to do things in certain ways, and it's very, very easy to squash and lose that curiosity, to lose that sense of I wonder why that is, and those questions that automatically come to children. And most of the time they'll come up with questions that adults won't, simply because they're just the small things interest them. The curiosity about why those little bits do what they do are what drives them, and what they want to understand the world around them. And it's incredibly easy to squash curiosity, and it's incredibly hard to get it back again. I was also going to say, in terms of the part from the cultural capital that Phil was talking about, that I'm sure Rebecca will be able to explain a bit more about how they do it at Stalham, is that there is also the specific element of that, which is the science capital side of things. And actually that's a focus of mine, but I focus on it with the PGCE trainees. And it's about the specific experiences, knowledge, attitudes that children and teachers, to be honest, have regarding science and the products of science and the application of science and the importance of it as well, which I think is something that needs driving to sort of give them that grounding in understanding where science fits in their life, and that actually it's useful. And you know, even down to the simplicity of recognizing the simple thing of recognizing that the science that a plumber does or the science that a builder does every single day without overtly recognizing that they're doing it. And the understanding that's there is immense, but it's being able to recognize the science involved in everyday activities and every single job that you do. And I think that the building that and can help the aspirations and understanding that the children we work with.
Thanks very much, Dave. And if we come to you, Miriam, you've been waiting very patiently to comment there. So if we come to you, Miriam.
I think Rebecca's been waiting longer than me, so I think Rebecca was before me.
Oh,
okay,
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Some of what I was going to say actually has been covered by Dave, but we work very closely together, so I'm not surprised at all. And I agree with everything he said. I think we can learn a lot from early years colleagues, was what I was going to say. You know, that developing of that knowledge and understanding of the world. I think small children do that really well, and they're encouraged to do that. And we need to hold on to a lot of that approach as we move through the primary school. And good schools do that really well, so that we don't lose that curiosity. And again, it's about maintaining curiosity. And again, in preparation for today, I thought about some of the most successful projects that I've been involved with in schools, and the children have absolutely, you know, have enjoyed so much and have got so much from, and they've been those ones that have a real context, you know, something that has meaning to them, and done well. Those cross-curricular links can be really successful. It's important to me, I was going to comment later, but it fits in here, that we don't lose track of what's important about particular subjects. You don't want to make things so I'm not sure how to put this, but you want to keep those defined, working scientifically, for example, and make sure that they have understanding of that and they can see the context, rather than trying to link everything too much so it becomes a little bit sort of not focused. But I think having a project and seeing the different elements of different subjects within that is really important. And the other thing was to touch upon that, you know, history of science. So I think, again, that's something that we really discuss within with our teacher trainees, and trying to widen that out so it becomes about equality and diversity as well, and really looking at the scientists that we explore and the way that ideas have evolved, and make sure that we're open to lots of different ideas within that. But yeah.
Thanks very much, Miriam. And am I right? Did that cover your statement, Miriam, or is this a good moment to elaborate that as well?
I think it did. I mean, it's really interesting. I'm very, very keen with our trainees that we do use. We don't just look at what we need to cover within the national curriculum and how we teach that and the best ways of teaching that, but we really consider, you know, really starting points that will start that curiosity and maintain that curiosity through a project. So we make lots of use of exploring, using literature to set a challenge for the children, and really making good use of those links. I mean, the only other thing that I wanted to mention within my statement was I think it's really important that we consider how we support children, both who have additional needs or also children that are very good scientists, and that I'm very, very passionate that we should make sure that we identify those children who have excellent ideas and perhaps can explain their ideas very well, but don't necessarily manage to write them down coherently. And I've taught lots of children who actually are very good scientists, but perhaps the way that the curriculum has been organised within their school, they've not been able to record their ideas as neatly perhaps as another child who might not, you know, who might have some very good ideas but different ideas, and recognising and finding different ways for children to express their thinking is really important to me.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And I think that might complement your interest, Rebecca, in assessment that you're maybe going to comment on through our discussion today as well, about how we recognise appropriately and effectively the understanding or the aptitudes that young people may have.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many things from those conversations that just happened that I could comment on. One thing that I would say in response to what Miriam said is absolutely, I completely agree. It's about finding that balance of making sure that our cross-curricular elements are purposeful. I think sometimes the danger, particularly for primary teachers where science is perhaps not their strength, where the danger can be, where a project can be perhaps English-based or music-based, and it can be a subject that they are much more confident in, and sometimes the science can be diluted with the other subjects, purely because that's the comfort zone that they are in. And I think the important aspect is not to place links for the sake of links, having those really meaningful links, and when you are working on something, making sure that you are really mapping out the science that you want the children to be able to learn, understand and apply. And I think that's the real sort of key element to make it really successful cross-curricular linked science. Example of what we did in Stalham is we combined literacy. We looked at the book Here We Are, and there's some beautiful illustrations in that book, and we did it all the way from nursery all the way to year 6, and we took a page of the book, and each one of those books we provide some sort of science investigation for them to be able to look at. And it was fantastic. It worked the same because we looked at the Earthshot Prize as well, so they were looking at why it was really important for us to look at renewable energy, looking at recycling and looking at all of those elements. So having English or book as a hook for them to be able to do it is really, really fabulous way of them doing it. But again, making sure that we're mapping out so the science is really explicit within it, so we're having the opportunity to apply it. And I think I'm going slightly off track, but I will come back to it. But going on what Dave and Phil said for the Science Capital, one thing I think us as primary colleagues are really responsible for, I know there's a big paper out about secondary science, how it's important to develop Science Capital. And I know that Dave, here we go as a plug, Dave, I know that Dave has done a great paper on saying that actually Science Capital needs to start in primary school, and it's absolutely right. We need to have parental involvement. We need to find ways as a school, as a science community, to be able to get families into our schools, into our scientific, into the universities, into our libraries, into all of those different people, to make science accessible for everyone, because we're not going to be able to support those disadvantaged children unless we have the families there that can experience it as well. So I think that's something that at Stalham we're really passionate about. We provide lots of opportunities for children and families to come in and have science family days, and the Great Science Share is a really fantastic way to develop that as well. It's a nationwide event, and again it's all about children developing that science capital, developing their curiosity and ideas. And that can happen in a school, it can happen in a university, it can happen in a village hall. And I think having that is really, really, really important from that point of view. And it kind of leads me on to my concern going forward is my concern, certainly from primary colleagues that I've been speaking to, is because of what's been going on with COVID, and that there's a real emphasis on catch up, making sure we're catching up on maths and making sure we're catching up on English and making sure we're catching up on all of our subjects. And yes, absolutely, catching up is really important. But because of the accountability measures that have been put in place, I'm worried that creativity will be stifled or prevented due to the fact that there'll be so much focus on making sure that the children have specific subject knowledge that they can recall and all the things in terms of catch up. And that it worries me that we don't have that creative outlet in terms of assessments to be able to do that, because we're focusing so much on what does the children need to achieve by the end of Key Stage 1, what does that children need to achieve to be creative, to be on track by Key Stage 2. And the easy go-to way to do that is through exams or tests, but there are so many different other ways in which the children can apply the knowledge that they've gained that doesn't have to be a test and can be creative. We had a really lovely example where we asked the children, we were looking at buoyancy in year 5, and we asked the children, we gave them a list of things that they had to show, the scientific knowledge they had to display, and also the scientific vocabulary, and we said to them, go however you want to do it, show us how you understand buoyancy. And one particular child recorded in slow motion on a slow motion camera They put tea leaves in sparkling water, and they were recording what was happening. So they recorded it in slow motion, and then they narrated over the side of it, like a little bit David Attenborough style. And it was absolutely fantastic way to show that knowledge that a test doesn't need to show. And I think as teachers, we need to be really brave and think there are creative ways in which the children can show their learning. It doesn't just have to be a test.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think you've taken us to a good area of discussion, maybe to draw our panel discussion towards the close today. In terms of with that illustration, what sort of dispositions, if you like, or approaches to science should we be trying to find space for and to preserve as young people learn? But also, how do we do that? So clearly there are many reports, many papers that highlight, emphasize, describe creativity in science and argue for its importance. Maybe less often they actually illustrate what that might be or what we might actually do. So I just wondered from the rest of the panel if there are any other examples or steps that you feel should be taken in teaching and in formal education to preserve the spaces for creativity and the forms of creativity that are distinctive to learning in science, that aren't necessarily about hybrid learning, linking with the arts and humanities, for example, but what is inherent about creativity in science education. And I can see everyone has a comment to make, which is great. So if we come to Miriam first of all, Philip, Keith, Dave, and then back to Rebecca. Thank you.
As Rebecca was giving her example, I remembered a particularly lovely example of where a child was unable to present something in a way that really suited their skills and meant that they were able to show such a great level of understanding that the other children could also draw upon. And it was a child who, it was a teacher who facilitated a project to do with the digestive system. And instead of, and apologies to anyone who uses this approach, but I get lots of homework with my own child that tends to be make a poster of this, or, and it tends to be very similar all the time. But these children were allowed to present what they thought about their digestive system in lots of different ways. And this particular child used Minecraft to create a model of a person. And I often draw upon this example with the trainees, and I think that was about sort of taking some risks, having that really good teaching about the digestive system so the child really understood it, but then they were able, and homework was a really good way of being able to do this, because there was the time to then present it in a way that makes sense to them and the other children can then draw upon, and it's very interesting for them and something that they were excited by. I thought that was really good. Oh, and I did also very quickly wanted to add, one of the things I was going to say within my statement was, when I looked up what the definition of creativity was, I was particularly interested in that idea of being able to invent things. And we've talked a lot about, whether children come across an idea that actually is already there, or, and they sort of invent it for themselves. And I agree with all of that. But one thing I'm really keen to do is see children develop to become those inventors and those scientists in the future that will discover new things. So I think we've got to enable some of that creativity in our teaching.
Thank you, Miriam. And now to Philip.
It's fascinating discussion so far. Some of the sort of different creative things that I've drawn upon. Sometimes use of poetry. People always think that science and poetry are very different, but they do have some good roots. I remember one child once wrote a poem called "The Loneliest Bull," about after we did selective breeding and IVF, and the fact this bull was just very sad that he'd never see all these offspring that he'd sired. And I thought that was a very different way of doing a homework, and I thought that was quite impressive. The other sort of creativity, I call it the power of plasticine, to use plasticine modelling, even in A level, to do, for example, modelling of molecular mechanisms, for example, of cystic fibrosis. And of course, people forget that is a very nice, again, using like stop animation there to actually model and assess understanding. So again, you can assess without having a written examination. And one thing we talked about, having this space to be creative. Many of us, myself included, really got into science by reading science fiction as a child. And again, one of my big concerns is that, do we have enough space to allow children to read and read science fiction? Do we know good science fiction and appropriate science fiction authors to actually pinpoint our young readers to? Because many great inventions have come, were first thought of in science fiction.
Thank you very much, Philip, and I'll come straight to Keith. Thank you.
Hello, I want to briefly mention one example, and I'm going to just briefly give you some context so you understand when the example was used. I'm going to tell you what the example is, and I'm going to say why I'm giving you this example. I mean, the context was for an enrichment programme that when I was working at Cambridge, we put on with some of the local schools. Particularly, somebody mentioned about gifted and talented. This was a time when gifted and talented was seen as being a big issue in the schools. And we put on a programme for year 10 students who the teachers thought would benefit. They didn't have to be gifted and talented, but those who were interested in science would benefit. And we run a number of after-school sessions. And I designed an activity one day for the period when the students were collecting, because they came from different schools, some arrived on bicycles, some on foot and so on. And they used to go to the cafe and have a cup of tea while they were waiting for the start. And I devised an activity for them to try out while they were waiting. It was a fun activity. So that was the context. And the activity involved a card game. And basically there were two sets of cards. One set of cards was science concepts from the science curriculum. And the other set of cards was just everyday things, everyday ideas or phenomena. And basically they were given some of each card, and there were some rules. And to win the game, you had to basically get rid of all your cards by pairing up and having a science analogy. I picked that one out because I remember someone said chemical reactions are like hell. And then they could only get away with that, of course, if they could then explain to the rest of the group they were playing with why they thought chemical reactions were like hell. They couldn't just say anything and put it down. The others had to see there was some kind of rationale. And actually, this seemed to go down quite well, at least with that group of students. Now, I use that example because it may not sound as exciting as some of the things some of you have been talking about, because I think that is an example which, to my mind, has a strong link with science itself. Because an important part of scientific practice is using scientific analogies and metaphors and similes and analogies. And scientists develop these as part of their creative process. Just as one example, Lisa Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch talking about why a certain reaction, nuclear reaction, might have occurred, and saying, well, what if we think the nucleus of an atom might be a bit like a drop of liquid? And that was a model that was developed and used as an idea and is still actually used today to explain some aspects of nuclear science. And so scientists do this in their exploring of ideas, testing out of ideas, thinking about how they can approach a phenomenon to set up then experimental tests they might do. Scientists also use it in a pedagogic sense. So scientists, when they're either writing for other scientists or talking to a public audience, will say, well, actually, this scientific concept is a bit like that thing you know about already, which of course is what teachers do when they're teaching science. They say, well, this is a bit like a high jump, or it's a bit like people on a bus or whatever. So it's something that's part of science practice. And it's something that students will meet, for example, in secondary school, they'll learn about circuits, and they'll probably be told to think about circuits in terms of role-playing, children running around the room with packets of energy, or thinking of bread delivery lorries going out to the supermarket from the warehouse, or whatever. And they might think, well, why would we be taught about that in science? Because that's a bit childish. That's not real proper science. But actually, it is part of the processes of science to develop ideas by analogy, by metaphor, and so on. So that was just one quick idea of children to have a kind of a fun game that they actually seem to engage with. But it does lead into an aspect of something that's inherent to science, which isn't to say it isn't important to link science with poetry and art and all these other things, but it's just an example where you can perhaps try and find something that's actually inherent to science itself, where there is some creativity and we can introduce it to children and they can actually try it out for themselves.
Thank you very much, Keith. And from my background in language and literature education, that's sort of fascinating, a parallel with metaphorical thinking and expression there. There's very, very similar mode of, or indeed the same mode of thinking. So thank you, Dave, and then to Rebecca.
Yeah, I was just thinking, actually, it was an example of what I did with my year fours, I think it was. I'm trying to remember. It was quite a while ago now. It was very much focusing on the science of everyday things that they see and around them and trying to understand what's about. So we were looking at the science of musical instruments. And we did it by actually first exploring the musical instruments, looking at the materials they're made from, looking at how sound is produced, how you listen, how you hear sound, how sound changes, all those aspects, but then applying that to make their own tunable stringed musical instruments. So they had to select and use their knowledge of all of the bits that they've learned from that to design and create it. And they came up with some amazing stringed instruments that were physically tunable. They could, but throughout the entire thing I could listen to them talking and explaining and discussing and using the language that I wanted them to be using to explain why they were doing what they were doing to design their instrument, why they were choosing that particular material for the string, why they were making the fretboard and all that, and why they were doing the things that they were doing, all based around the science of it as well. So it's that bringing in and contextualizing and giving them opportunities to demonstrate the language that they've learned, the scientific knowledge that they've learned, but at the same time walking away from something in their world that they know a bit more about and they understand how it works. But we finished it by getting them to play to parents, and okay, they weren't the best musical instruments in the world, but the engagement with them from parents and getting parents to come in and having that building that relationship with parents and home, and again the science capital of parents and engagement from them and people at home is absolutely vital. And it's that creative aspect that you can bring in.
Thank you, Dave. And actually you touch on there something that I think has been tacit in much of our conversation here as well, is around creativity through collaboration as well, and it being a communal experience of learning as well. If we come to you, sorry, Dave, and if we come to you, Rebecca, finally, for a concluding comment.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of creative elements that I find work in terms of assessment and things, I think the earlier you introduce open-ended tasks to children, the better. So a lot of the tasks and homework that we do at the school that I work in is giving them a real clear, this is the vocabulary that you need to be making sure that you're using. These are the science objectives that you need to be being able to understand. The understanding you need to show me what you can do. And I think that's really important. You're giving them the sort of foundation and scaffolding support of what you're wanting to achieve, of what you're wanting to get from them. The earlier we introduce open-ended tasks where they can show their preferred method of communicating their creativity, I think the better we will be in terms of them going up and up into secondary school to be able to show those creative elements. Because as we discussed earlier, creativity can be, and curiosity can be killed quite quickly. So, the more we introduce it earlier on and the more we nurture it in terms of open-ended tasks, but again, as I said, with making sure that you're giving that clear criteria that they need to meet, I mean, you just get so many different ideas. One example of something that I did in secondary school when I was a secondary school teacher is I asked them to talk to me about chemical bonding, and one of the children did dating profiles. So they made dating profiles of what they had to offer as an atom and what they were seeking in order to form chemical bonds. And it was fabulous and showed a real understanding of transfer of electrons. So again, that wouldn't have happened had we not given that sort of open-ended, show me what you know and show me how you can do it creatively.
Thanks ever so much, Rebecca, and thank you, colleagues, for each of those examples. I think what they illustrate as well is the creativity in teaching, and to come back to the point that Philip started with, actually, about knowledge, that to create those open-ended activities that do create the conditions for learning, that there's a level of teacher expertise and knowledge and understanding necessary to be able to frame open-ended tasks well, so that they are successful and they do give students those spaces to find things, discover things for themselves. So thank you very much for your comments, everyone in our discussion. Thank you for joining the discussion, sharing your expertise and your experience with those examples. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.